It is shortly after midnight on July 17, 1918, in the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children stand against a wall. They have been told they are being moved to a safer location. They have been told to wait for a photograph. Then a dozen armed men burst through the door. The first volley kills Nicholas instantly, a bullet through the head. Alexandra and her eldest daughter Olga fall next. But the 3 younger daughters survived the initial gunfire. They have sewn diamonds and jewels into their corsets for safekeeping, and the gems deflect the bullets. The guards finish them with bayonets. The Tsarevich Alexei, 13 years old and hemophiliac, clings to his dead father's shirt. He is shot in the head. Anastasia, the youngest daughter, is the last to die. She screams as the bayonets come down. The bodies are loaded onto a truck, driven into the forest, doused with acid, and buried in an unmarked grave. The Bolsheviks announce that Nicholas has been executed. They say nothing about the family. For decades, the world will wonder if anyone survived. But here is what the Bolsheviks did not announce. While the Tsar and his immediate family were being slaughtered in that basement, dozens of other Romanovs were scattered across Russia. Some were already dead, some were about to be executed, and some were running for their lives. This is what happened to the Romanov bloodline after the murder of the Tsar, and how the survivors of history's most famous royal family escaped Russia to build new lives across the world. The House of Romanov had ruled Russia for 304 years. They came to power in 1613 when 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov was elected Tsar during a period of chaos known as the Time of Troubles. Russia was then a landlocked, backward kingdom, isolated from Europe. His descendants transformed it into the largest empire on earth. Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, dragged Russia into modernity by sheer force of will. He built a navy from nothing, defeated Sweden to gain access to the Baltic Sea, and constructed an entirely new capital, St. Petersburg, on swampland seized from his enemies. He declared Russia an empire, and himself its first emperor. Catherine the Great, a German princess who seized the throne from her own husband in 1762, expanded the empire south and west. She annexed Crimea, partitioned Poland, and corresponded with Voltaire while her armies conquered. By her death in 1796, Russia stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Alexander I defeated Napoleon. His armies marched into Paris in 1814, and Russia emerged as the dominant power in Europe. But the dynasty's final century was marked by violence and reform that always came too late. Alexander II freed 23 million serfs in 1861, the largest emancipation in human history. 20 years later, revolutionaries threw a bomb into his carriage on the streets of St. Petersburg. He bled to death on the floor of the Winter Palace. His son Alexander III responded with repression. His grandson Nicholas II inherited an empire straining under the weight of industrialization, defeat in war against Japan, and a population demanding change. By 1917, the dynasty that had built the largest country on earth had run out of time. By 1917, the extended Romanov family numbered over 65 members. They lived in palaces across St. Petersburg and Moscow, summered in Crimean villas on the Black Sea, and had married into every royal house in Europe. Queen Victoria's granddaughter Alexandra became Tsarina. The Tsar's mother, Maria Feodorovna, was sister to Britain's Queen Alexandra and aunt to King George V. Romanov blood flowed through the veins of royalty from London to Copenhagen to Athens to Madrid. But 300 years of autocracy ended in a matter of days. In February 1917, bread riots in Petrograd turned into a revolution. Nicholas II abdicated on March 15th. He hoped to take his family to England, where his cousin King George V sat on the throne. George V refused. The British government feared that welcoming the Tsar would inflame socialist sentiment at home. The invitation was withdrawn. It was a decision George V would regret for the rest of his life. The provisional government placed Nicholas and his family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October, the family was moved to Siberia. By spring 1918, they were in Yekaterinburg, in a house the Bolsheviks called the House of Special Purpose. The purpose became clear on July 17th, but Nicholas and his immediate family were not the only Romanovs killed that summer. The Bolsheviks were systematic. The day after the Yekaterinburg massacre, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna was thrown alive into a mine shaft near Alapayevsk, along with 5 other Romanov princes. Soldiers threw grenades down after them. Elizabeth, a nun who had founded a convent in Moscow after her husband's assassination, reportedly survived the initial fall and was heard singing hymns from the darkness below. The Bolsheviks sealed the mine. In January 1919, 4 Grand Dukes held in the Peter and Paul fortress in Petrograd were taken out and shot. Nicholas Mikhailovich, George Mikhailovich, Paul Alexandrovich, and Dmitry Konstantinovich. Their bodies were buried in a mass grave. Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, Nicholas II's brother, had been the technical czar for a single day after Nicholas abdicated. He was executed secretly in June 1918, a month before his brother. The Bolsheviks staged his death to look like an escape attempt. In total, 18 Romanovs were killed during the revolution and its aftermath. But 47 others survived, and their escapes read like adventure novels. The largest group of survivors gathered in Crimea. In the chaos of 1917, the Tsar's mother, Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, had fled south with her daughters Grand Duchesses Xenia and Olga, along with their husbands and children. They sheltered in estates overlooking the Black Sea, protected briefly by German occupation, then hunted by the advancing Bolsheviks. Maria Feodorovna refused to believe her son was dead. She would maintain this denial for the rest of her life, waiting for Nicholas to walk through the door, dismissing every piece of evidence as Bolshevik propaganda. As the Red Army closed in, King George V finally acted. He sent the British battleship HMS Marlborough to rescue his aunt. On April 11, 1919, the Dowager Empress stood on the deck as the ship steamed out of Yalta harbor. A passing troop ship carrying White Russian soldiers spotted the tiny, black-clad figure of the former empress. Across the water came the strains of the Russian imperial anthem, sung by men sailing to their deaths fighting the Bolsheviks. Maria Feodorovna watched the Crimean coast until it disappeared. She never saw Russia again. The Marlborough carried 17 Romanovs to safety, along with servants, nurses, governesses, and several hundred cases of luggage. Among the passengers was Prince Felix Yusupov, the man who had murdered Rasputin 2 years earlier. His wife Irina was Nicholas II's niece. They brought bags of soil from their estate, all they would ever have of home. Other Romanovs escaped by different routes. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Yusupov's co-conspirator in Rasputin's murder, had been exiled to Persia as punishment. The exile saved his life. He eventually made his way to Paris. Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich had supported the revolution initially, marching his naval guards to the Duma with red ribbons on their uniforms. When the Bolsheviks turned on the aristocracy, he fled to Finland, walking across the frozen border while his pregnant wife followed in a horse-drawn cart. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna the Elder, one of the most formidable women in the dynasty, spent 1918 wandering through the war-torn Caucasus with her sons. When the Bolsheviks approached, they fled to Anapa on the Black Sea, where they spent 14 months waiting for rescue. She finally boarded an Italian ship to Venice in February 1920. Prince Gavril Konstantinovich survived only because his wife was friends with the writer Maxim Gorky, who was friends with Lenin. Gorky personally lobbied for Gavril's release from prison. The couple eventually escaped through Finland. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, Nicholas II's youngest sister, refused to leave on the Marlborough with her mother. She and her husband Nikolai hid with a former bodyguard in a small village, where she gave birth to her second son in a rented farmhouse. They escaped through Novorossiysk to Denmark in 1920. The survivors scattered across Europe, building new lives from the wreckage of empire. Paris became the unofficial capital of the Russian emigration, home to taxi-driving princes and restaurant-owning countesses who had once danced at imperial balls. Nice, on the French Riviera, attracted so many exiled aristocrats that local patisseries stayed open late during Orthodox fasts. Copenhagen sheltered the Dowager Empress in her nephew's palace. London took in Grand Duchess Xenia, who lived in a grace and favor cottage provided by King George V until her death in 1960. Many survivors struggled with poverty. The jewels they had smuggled out of Russia were sold piece by piece. The men, trained only for military command and court ceremony, took whatever work they could find. Prince Felix Yusupov, once the richest man in Russia, eventually sold his Paris mansion and lived in modest circumstances until his death in 1967. Maria Feodorovna lived her final years in Denmark, supported by her nephew King Christian X and a pension from King George V. She refused to believe her son and grandchildren were dead. When investigators presented evidence of the murders, she dismissed it. When impostors appeared claiming to be Anastasia or Alexei, she refused to meet them. She died in 1928 at the age of 80, still waiting. The most famous impostor was Anna Anderson, a woman pulled from a Berlin canal in 1920 after a suicide attempt. She claimed to be Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter, saying she had survived the massacre by hiding among the bodies of her family. Anderson's claim divided the Romanov survivors for decades. Some believed her, most did not. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna met her and declared her a fraud. Prince Felix Yusupov called her a sick, hysteric, and frightful play actress. The controversy spawned books, films, and a Broadway musical. In 1956, Ingrid Bergman won an Oscar playing a fictionalized version of Anderson in Anastasia. In 1997, an animated film told a fantasy version of the story, released even after DNA had proved Anderson was an impostor. But science eventually settled the question. In 1991, a grave containing most of the imperial family was discovered in a forest near Yekaterinburg. The site had actually been found in 1979 by amateur investigators, but they kept it secret from the Soviet authorities. After the fall of communism, the grave was officially excavated. DNA testing, using samples from Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, a great-nephew of the Tsarina, confirmed the identities. In 2007, the remains of the two missing children, Alexei and one of the daughters, were found in a separate grave nearby. And in 1994, DNA extracted from Anderson's tissue samples proved she was not related to the Romanovs. She was almost certainly Franziska Shanskowska, a mentally ill Polish factory worker who had disappeared from Berlin shortly before Anastasia appeared. Anderson died in 1984 in Charlottesville, Virginia, still insisting she was Anastasia. Her supporters still refused to accept the DNA evidence. Today, approximately 30 descendants of the House of Romanov are scattered across the world. They live in France, the United States, Spain, and, increasingly, Russia itself. The question of who leads the family remains bitterly disputed. Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna, great-great-granddaughter of Tsar Alexander II, claims to be the rightful head of the imperial house. She styles herself Empress, lives in Madrid, and issues orders and titles from exile. Most other Romanov descendants reject her claim. The Romanov Family Association, representing the majority of the dynasty's male-line descendants, argues that Maria's father's marriage was not dynastic and that her family forfeited their succession rights decades ago. The dispute turned dramatic in October 2021 when Maria's son Grand Duke George Mikhailovich married in St. Petersburg. It was billed as the first Romanov royal wedding in Russia since the Revolution. The ceremony at St. Isaac's Cathedral drew 1,500 guests, including representatives of royal houses from across Europe. The bride wore a 27-carat diamond tiara and a gown embroidered with the Romanov eagle. An honor guard in imperial uniforms escorted the couple through the streets. Vladimir Putin did not attend. His spokesman said our wedding has nothing to do with our agenda. The Russian government sent no congratulations. George and his wife now live in Moscow with their son Alexander, born in 2022, and daughter Kira, born in 2025. Whether they represent the future of the Romanov dynasty or merely a footnote to its history depends on whom you ask. The palaces the Romanovs built still stand, monuments to vanished power. The Winter Palace is now the Hermitage Museum, one of the largest art collections in the world. The Alexander Palace, where Nicholas and his family were first held prisoner after the abdication, has been restored as a memorial. Tsarskoye Selo, the summer residence with its famous Amber Room, draws millions of tourists each year. Yekaterinburg's House of Special Purpose was demolished in 1977 on orders from a local Communist Party official named Boris Yeltsin, who 2 decades later would preside over the burial of the family he had helped erase. A cathedral dedicated to the murdered family now stands on the site, drawing pilgrims from across Russia. In 1998, 80 years after their murder, the remains of Nicholas II, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of Russian emperors since Peter the Great. President Boris Yeltsin attended the funeral and delivered an extraordinary apology on behalf of the Russian state. "We are all guilty," Yeltsin said. "It is impossible to lie to ourselves by justifying what happened through political necessity." It was the first official Russian acknowledgement that the murders had been a crime. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children as passion-bearers, saints who met their deaths with Christian forbearance rather than resisting their fate. The bones of Alexei and the remaining daughter were not interred with the rest of the family. The Russian Orthodox Church has not fully accepted the DNA evidence. Identifying them and their remains sit in a state repository, waiting for a resolution that may never come. The Romanovs ruled for 304 years. They fell in 304 days between February 1917 and the final murders in early 1918. Those who survived built new lives in exile, had children and grandchildren, and watched from afar as their homeland transformed through Stalin's terror, World War II, the Cold War, and the collapse of communism. Today, the dynasty exists in fragments: a disputed claimant in Madrid, a young family in Moscow, scattered descendants across Paris and New York and London. The palaces are museums now. The crown jewels sit in Kremlin vaults. The empire that stretched across 11 time zones is gone forever, but the bloodline endures. A century after the basement in Yekaterinburg, the Romanovs survive. And they are not the only dynasty that lost an empire and scattered across the world. When the Romanovs fell, the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary were already in their final days. Emperor Karl I would die in exile just 4 years after Nicholas. If you want to see what happened to the Habsburg bloodline after the fall of their empire, watch our video on the fate of the last emperor's children.